The theme for today's session is what I call holding on and hanging on. Holding on and hanging on. And I've chosen the theme because at various points in my life, and probably right now, I am experiencing and I have experienced a number of setbacks and disappointments and delays and frustrations, failures, call it whatever you choose to. And I thought it best to talk about something that I believe is very relevant to a lot of people, but also something that everyone will experience. Someone once said that the one constant change or thing in life is change. The one thing that we are guaranteed to experience is change. And it's important that you prepare for change, you expect change, you welcome change, you adapt when change comes, and you try not to resist it. Adaptability is one of the most important qualities that we all need, not just in how to live, but also in how to live effectively. Think about this, for example. We have heard about dinosaurs, but dinosaurs are no longer because they could not adapt. However, we have, you might say, rabbits and lizards, and they've existed for so many thousand years because they had the ability to adapt. So adaptation is one of the most important qualities for a successful life. If you cannot adapt to the season or to change, you position yourself in what I call an unfortunate place, because unfortunately, those who cannot adapt to change are usually those who are left behind. Alvin Toffler said that in times of change, learners will inherit the earth, whilst the learned will be fully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. And so change is something that we're all going to experience. And what I would like to do in this session is help you prepare for change when it comes. It will come in various ways. It might come in the form of a crisis. It might come in the form of problems. But the one thing that I can promise you is that whenever you have a crisis, you also have an opportunity. The Asiatic word for crisis is a two-letter symboled word. One says danger and the other says opportunity. However, opportunity doesn't come to you the way we expect it. In many ways, it comes to us packaged as a problem. You have to unwrap what I call the covering, which might be the visual, emotional reaction you have as it being a problem, and look inside, look within. And when you look within, you'll find that there's a great opportunity that hides and awaits to be used. At various points in my life, I realized that I'm going to have good times and I'm going to have bad times. But at the moment that I'm going through each experience or cycle, I'm not going to know which is which. So one of the things I've disciplined myself to do is welcome all experiences and see the experience as an adventure, see the experience as a puzzle that I have to try and solve. And by solving the puzzle, I get rewards. Those rewards might come in the form of perhaps growth, progress. It might be in the form of success. It might also be in the form of perhaps lessons learned that I can pass on and I can share with other people. So you're going to have change. Some of that change will come dressed or camouflaged as problems or crisis. As a matter of fact, in life, in your life, you're either in a crisis, you've just left a crisis, or you're potentially heading towards a crisis. And like the waves of the ocean, you're going to have problems and problems and crises. And in between both, we call it the dance. the dance of life, and that could be the point where you celebrate and you enjoy yourself and you throw your hands up and you say life is beautiful. But you must remember that just like the tides go out, they come back. And so it will be the crisis and the problems you experience. And if you have the philosophy where you say, I do not want problems, then you've got to recognize that it's an impossible desire. As a matter of fact, I'm reminded by a story of the great author, Norman Vincent Peale. And he was coming back from, I think he was coming back from either an appointment or coming back from a planned schedule, something. He was coming back from somewhere and someone bumped into him. And this young man said, listen, Norman Vincent Peale, I'm so excited to see you. I've always wanted to meet you. I think you're amazing. I think you are exceptional. I have a problem and I would be indebted to you for the rest of my life if you can help me get rid of these problems. And Norman looked at him and said, Norman Vincent Peale, just in case you're not aware, is the person who wrote, the author who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. He wrote a few other books, but the most popular was The Power of Positive Thinking. He also wrote another book that goes, You Can If You Think You Can. But he was an exceptional speaker, writer, and teacher. And Norman looked at this young man and said, oh, please tell me what is the problem. And he said, well, the young man said, well, I don't know where to start, but I have all these problems and I just want all these problems to disappear. And Norman said, well, you're quite lucky because I've just finished where I'm coming from. I've just been with people and I've been in an environment where the people there have absolutely no problems. And the young man said to Norman, please, can you take me there? I'll do anything you want to do. If you can just take away the problems, you take me right there. And Norman Vincent Peale said to him, well, it's the local cemetery, which I thought was quite interesting. He had just come out from the local cemetery. And he said to the young man, listen, the only people who do not have problems are people who are in the grave, people who are either insane or people who are dead. He said, problems are a sign of life. And you have to welcome problems, because if you have problems, it means that life is trying to help you grow. Life is trying to help you develop. Life is trying to reward you, but it's disguising opportunities as problems. And that every time you solve a problem, you grow. You get a reward. So he said to the young man, cheer up. Problems are a sign of life. And I believe that, and I accept everything that Norman said. As a matter of fact, I would say this to you: if you do not have problems, it's a sign. And now I want you to just imagine this. It's almost a sign that life doesn't trust you anymore. And what you should do is go on your knees and cry out to God and say, God, don't you trust me any longer? Please, please give me some problems. You need problems. As a matter of fact, you should be asking for big, juicy problems. And here is the reason. The quality of your life, the level of your success, is always in proportion to the quantity and the quality of value you create for other people, and the problems you solve for them, the intensity you bring to the game, but also the significance you create for them. So problems create opportunities. So if you have problems, I want you to throw your hands up and rejoice, because it's a sign of life. But more than anything, it's a sign that life still trusts you, or God still trusts you and believes in you. If you don't have problems, on the other hand, then I want to ask you to go on your knees and start crying out and raise your hands up and say, I need problems. Don't you trust me any longer? Because those who have problems are those who have the unique ability to use their creative faculties of the mind, are those who can use their ingenuity, they're those who can use their ability to think, to reason, to imagine, to collaborate, to engage with other people, to seek for solution. And those people are really living the true life. I believe you're either living in a bubble, which I call a comfort zone, or you're living on the edge. And if you're living in that bubble or your comfort zone, you generally take up too much space. What you should do is move to the edges of your limits and take a plunge. Take a gamble, take a risk, take a jump, make a splash. Don't be like those who somehow are tiptoeing their way through life, heading towards death. Knowing that no one gets out of this life alive, why don't you take a run at it and make a splash as you go down the path towards your destiny, and just have fun. And part of that challenge is as you run down, you have problems. And so what I wanted to do today was share perhaps some of the lessons I've learned, maybe one or two principles that I'd like you to think about. Firstly, when you're going through a problem, the most important thing you must do when you're going through a crisis, the most important thing you must do is get hold of your attitude. Your attitude is the most important and the most flexible thing you have. It's more flexible than time itself and more flexible than your circumstances. So, number one is get hold of your attitude. Keep a positive mental attitude. You must hold on to what I call the gate of your mind, because in many cases, a problem or a threat, a challenge, a fear perceived is much worse than an experienced threat. And by that, what I mean is the mind has this ability to minimize or maximize experiences. It can make them bigger, it can make them smaller. So in many cases, whenever we have problems, the battle is really in the mind. It's not in reality. Because if you have a problem, for example, you have a problem where you think you're going to lose your home. The truth of the matter is, you haven't lost your home yet, but you sit up all night worrying to death. The perception of you losing your home, the perceived fear is much greater than if the bank called you and said, listen, we are going to recover your home. When it's happened to you, you find out it's done. There's nothing you can do about it. So the most important thing is, number one, get hold of your attitude. Take control of your mind. Control your mind very, very carefully. Number two, sit down and document in detail what the problem is. Write it down. Ask yourself 3 questions. Number one, what is the worst that can happen? So in doing that, what you're trying to do is make a note of all your fears and the facts. So you capture the problem in writing, you make note of the fears and your facts. You ask yourself the question, what is the worst that can happen? You imagine, and you just play a role play and allow yourself that point to just say, okay, what's the worst that can happen? Okay, I lose my home. What's the worst that can happen? Okay, I lose my relationship. What's the worst that can happen? Well, I get fired from the job, or I can't make the payment, or whatever it might be that you're worried about. Write it down. In many cases, when you write it down, one of the things you figure out very quickly is that it's not as bad as it seems. Number two, even if you think it's as bad as it seems, you must put it into perspective. To put into perspective, what I mean is this. I'll give you a good example. One of the things that I use as a way of putting things in perspective is, a couple of years ago, I lost a brother. Still love him. Will always love him. Still miss him. Will always miss him. And for me, that was the most tragic experience I've ever gone through. I still grieve every day. And on a scale of 0 to 10, if I were to rank that, I would have said it was more than a 10. Because it was painful. It's still painful. So whenever I go through a challenge or a problem, I ask myself, what score would I give this? Considering that I give the loss of a loved one a 10. What score will I give this? And in many cases, what I'm worried about, what I'm anxious about, what I'm stressed about, I wouldn't even put it on the rank. Sometimes it would score a 1 or a 2. So one of the things you want to do is put things in perspective. Little kids always have this saying that I think is so true. If you've ever seen a mother or a father dramatizing an experience, the little child says, I think you're making a big deal out of what happened. And that is true sometimes. Sometimes we over dramatize experiences. So put things in perspective. And by putting things in perspective, what you figure out and what you realize is that you're focusing on the wrong thing. That perhaps you have more love, more friends, more opportunities around you, and you're focused on the wrong thing. You see, because whatever you focus on controls your feelings, and your feelings determine your emotional state. Your emotional state determines the quality of your well-being. So choose your focus. By putting things in perspective, it gives you an idea about whether you're making the main thing the main thing. Number 3, the next thing you must do once you put in perspective is ask yourself, assuming that the worst happened, could I live with what happened? Could I live with that worst case? If the answer is yes, then it simply means that you're not dead. That if it happened, maybe it will set you back a few months, a few years, a few days. It'll break your heart, but you'll move on. Now, going to the end and saying, okay, the worst has happened, gives you this strength whereby you then realize that you're still here and you're still capable and you still have life in you, and therefore you can still survive. Now, once you've played that role, reverse it. Ask yourself the question, what is the best that can happen? The best that can happen is that you successfully get out of that situation if it's within your power to control. If it's out of your power to control, then you simply find a way to grow through that journey. So in life, I like to use 2 circles to demonstrate or explain a concept of how to have a fulfilled life. There are 2 circles. One circle I call things that are within your control. The second circle are things that are out of your control. If you bring the 2 of them together to form a ring, there'll be an intersection. Things you can control, things you cannot control, but there'll be an intersection based on things that you can choose how to respond to. So there might be things you cannot control, but you can choose what they mean. You can choose to rename the experience. You can choose how you respond to the experience. And that's where the key to having a good life comes in. That there are things you can control. You should focus on controlling those. But there'll be an intersection between things that you cannot control, but you still have the power of choice. And in those areas, very slim, you have the ability to choose what things mean in terms of what the experience or the circumstance means to you. You can choose to rename or reframe the experience. In other words, in my case, I'll give you a good example. When I lost my brother, for so many months, I grieved. I went through a period of denial. Then I went through a period of anger and remorse. I went through a period of grieving and sadness. But I got to a point where I said, well, just like we graduate from kindergarten because we outgrow that place, that my brother had outgrown this world. And so he had graduated. So I reframed and I renamed the experience. Rather than see it as death and loss, I saw it as graduation, meaning he had been promoted beyond this experience that we still have and we still share, we call life. And that gave me this strength because it meant that by focusing on him rather than myself. When I focused on myself, I wanted him to be here because it was all about me, how I would feel. Oh, I miss him. I love him. I can't share my time and spend time with him. It was all about me. Then I reframed it and I said, well, what if it were all about him? He had successfully graduated. Imagine being asked to go back to kindergarten and remain in kindergarten. Now think about how small the chairs were. You couldn't fit into the kindergarten chairs. Imagine being told as an adult to go back to kindergarten and sit in that chair and learn. You've outgrown it. So I changed the name. I changed the frame that I surrounded that experience with. And I found that by thinking of it from the point of view of graduation and that he's moved to a better place and he's happy, it changed how I felt and how I responded to all of the negative emotions I once had. So let me go back and now just remind you of what we've talked about. Number 1, I said, get hold of your attitude. Number 2, I said, put things in perspective. Ask yourself a question, what's the worst that can happen? then ask yourself, could you live with what the worst could be? Then ask yourself, what's the best that can happen? Then I said, reframe the experience. And then ask yourself a question and just get out a journal or a piece of paper and make a list of all the steps that you can take to make it the way you want it to be, if it's within your control. In my case, I couldn't change back the hands of time. It's out of my control. So I could change only what things meant. If, on the other hand, you've lost the job, that's within your control. Not to get the job back, but it means that you can take the lessons you've learned and then go searching for the right job for you. But make sure that you learn from the mistakes of the past. Number 3, or number 4, I'm not counting now, and this is a difficult one. In many ways, life tries to guide us. There are things we're doing we think is right for us, but in many cases, it's not. And therefore, one of the ways life works for us is to bring what I call detours and bring what I call deviations and redirections on our path. We might see it as a setback, we might see it as an obstacle, we might see it as a problem. But in principle, these are detours on our way to our destiny. If we were to go through what we felt was the right way, maybe we would have actually encountered a very difficult experience. And life has a way of redirecting us. Now, this doesn't happen always. Occasionally it does. And so one of the things you have to learn is that some of those detours come because life is trying to protect us, or life is trying to correct us. In many cases, the problems that we often face, the setbacks we often face, the challenges, are self-created. A crisis is simply when you've left things for too long and you haven't worked on them, or you haven't done what you should have done, and now life is demanding that you do it immediately. So I'll put it to you this way, and I'm going to deviate and I'll segue. When we talk about time, and I might do a concept of time in a different session, but there are two forms of time. There's vertical time and there's horizontal time. Vertical time is 24 hours. Horizontal time is your lifetime. Occasionally, there are things that happen where we have all of the time we need to resolve a problem. So I'll give you a good example. A mother has to go through a childbearing phase of about 270 days, which is about 9 months, to give birth. And she goes through birth pains. And it's a gradual process. She goes through the first month, the second month, and it's spread over 9 months. Now she can endure the pain because it's spread over a period. That's horizontal time. Now I want you to just imagine that all of the experience of childbearing, being nauseated, not being able to eat, being uncomfortable, birth pains, and all the experience that a mother goes through, if she had to do that in a 24-hour period, which is vertical time, very few mothers will want to go through that experience. And that's the same thing, that if she were to go through that experience, it would be a crisis because it's all happening at once. And that's the same way life works. For us, sometimes we've left things too late, and life comes and says, you have to make this change now. Life demands that you make the change now because it's trying to protect you from something in the future. So it puts you through a detour and says you must do this now. And by doing that, you correct your course and you grow. So I would say, sit down, go back to your journal, and just replay the steps that have led you to that crisis. And what you find in many cases that there was either something that you neglected, something that you could have done differently, something that you ignored, something that perhaps you didn't do with excellence, or something that maybe you didn't do with wisdom and proper knowledge. And it's important that you recognize what that is. I often say One of the most important things you must do every day is sit down at the end of the day and ask yourself two questions. Question number one is, what did I do right? And you want to ask that question so you can continue to do what you do well. You want to optimize it. You want to improve. You want to continue to do what's right. The second question is, what could I have done differently? To identify what you could have done differently, you need to be very honest and you need to do a review. You need to identify things that perhaps you shouldn't have done or things you could have done better. And the key here is for you to then capture the lessons learned so that the next day you can correct your course and not repeat the same thing. In the same way, sit down and look at what led you towards the crisis, and you'll find in many cases that there are gems of wisdom that await you, that if you capture those, in many ways, it creates success. I often say that success is simply a failed experience reversed with the right feedback. So, for example, if you go through a failure, if you were to sit down and say, knowing what I know now, using hindsight as my guide, if I were to replay and go from the end and play backwards, if I were to look at the feedback, if I was to take into account the corrections, if I was to take into account the advice that I ignored, and I reversed the steps that I took, what I've created is a success equation. So identify what you could have done leading up to that crisis and make notes of it. Now, once you've done that, the key thing is then action. To start taking the right steps towards you making that crisis go away. Remember, one of the things you did at the start was to say, what is the best that can happen? Now you have to go and do the work to make that happen. And that requires discipline, that requires dedication. In many cases, many of us experience much longer crises than we should because we're trying to solve our problems with one mind alone. There are 7 billion minds in the world. To go through life with one mind alone is not only arrogance, but it negates what I call the power of association, where two or more people come together for the common purpose of a goal or vision. You negate that. You're saying, I don't need that. I'm going to do it myself. And there are two ways of learning in life. You can learn from your experiences, which are normally mistakes, mainly because success is a poor teacher. Mistakes teach you more. Or you can learn from other people's experiences, what I call OPE, other people's experiences. But if you're willing to combine your experiences with other people, it's possible then to achieve much more. So I would say before you go about trying to make it the way you want it to be, find a few people who maybe experienced, people who can guide you, mentors, and bring a little bit more what I'll call expertise into handling that problem, if you can. It's always better to have two minds than one mind, but it has to be the right mind. Don't just call anyone in to deal with your problem. Make sure they're the right people. So I would say normally find 3 or 4 people and sit down with them and ask them to tell you, to share with you when they've gone through a crisis and what they did, and just listen. And you'll find just by listening, you learn some important ways that you can reapply their experiences into your life. And then ask them, sincerely say, I'm going through a problem and I just want to share some thoughts with you. This is my problem. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? And just listen to how they would deal with the problem. And when they finish, just say thank you. Tell them you're going to go away and think about it, and you're going to be speaking to a few other people, and eventually you'll decide on the best course of action, but that you may not apply what they've told you, but that you want them to be forgiving and to still keep an open mind in case you come back and you haven't done what they said, but you come back for extra help. People love being involved in helping. But by explaining it that way, what you're simply doing is you're trying to say to them, don't be judgmental. I might still make a mistake. I might do something different. But I want you to still be in my corner. I want you to still be amongst my circle of influence. Now, once they've shared their thoughts with you, combine that with your thoughts. Take the time to think. The biggest problem most people have, and I had, and I continue to have when I have a crisis, is that I think emotively. And you cannot think with your emotions if you're trying to solve a problem. To solve your problem, you need to think critically. That means you have to have a sound judgment in making decisions, in evaluating the options available, and that requires your reasoning faculty, and that should be void of all emotions. All emotions. You want to be optimistic? Yes. But optimism is often the enemy of execution. Positive thinking has its place. You want to think logically, find the answers, apply the solutions, and then hope positively. You don't want to be hoping positively and that leads you down the path of doing nothing. Now, I'm going to stop here because I think these are some important points I've shared so far. But if you can capture all of the thoughts I've shared with you, what you find is it's possible for you to create a breakthrough even when you're going through a failure or a crisis. I want to wish you the best, and I hope you do find success at the end of the journey.